I'm Deborah Klochko, and I'm the Executive Director and Chief Curator at the Museum of Photographic Arts. And I welcome you to today's Winescapes with Artists. And it's a little bit different format today. We do have some special guests, as well as our very own Kevin Linde, who is Manager of Adult and Digital Engagement, who will be moderating. And we are going to be talking about an important part of our collection, our Edward Curtis Oratones and their interesting journey of conservation that they've gone through over the last year and a half to 2 years. And so with that, little point of business, if you could all make sure your microphones are muted. And I don't know this, it's looking pretty good, but if we have trouble with visuals, we might ask you to turn your videos on. Use your chat button if you have questions as we're going, and we can certainly take questions at the end. So again, thank you for being here. And Kevin, I will let you take over.
All right, great. Thank you so much. Welcome everyone to Winescapes today, a very special Winescapes. I'm really excited to welcome all of our panelists today to take a look at this, as Deborah mentioned, important project that we've been working on for about 1.5 years, 2 years. And then also to take a broader look, of course, at the photographer, the legacy of his works, and also the contemporary conversations that are happening around his works as well. Again, as Deborah mentioned, my name is Kevin Linde, and I'm MOPA's Manager of Adult and Digital Engagement. So it's an absolute pleasure not only to be able to moderate the conversation today, but also to be able to have a little bit of insight into the conservation project because I was able to kind of dip into the project when it was ongoing with BACC in MOPA's in the building where MOPA resides in the park, and get to see the process along the way, which was really fascinating. And we actually have a little bit of footage here that we're going to share about that today to give all of you a sneak peek into the actual conservation process. But for today's talk, in 2018, MOPA embarked on an effort to conserve a series of unique Orotone images produced by Edward Curtis, which portray Indigenous communities of the American West. In this talk today, we'll explore MOPA's holdings by Curtis, learn more about the conservation project to preserve his Oratones, supported by Bank of America, and discuss the photographer's legacy as it relates to documentation and representation of Native American communities in the United States. So again, it's an absolute pleasure to have all of you here today. And I'd like to also go ahead and introduce our panelists that we have joining us today. Of course, all of you know Deborah, MOPA's Executive Director and Chief Curator. And then in addition to that, we have 2 other panelists who are joining us today to really help build out the conversation. So our other panelist is Elysia Poon. Elysia Poon is the Director of Indian Arts Research Center School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe, New Mexico. With 2 decades of experience in the museum field, Elysia's career has demonstrated a commitment to collaborative programming and a dedication to community-based collections care. Under her leadership, the IARC continues to be at the forefront of national conversations around how collecting institutions and Native American communities can work together to foster and promote cultural heritage and further contemporary art practices. Thank you again, Elysia, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Our third panelist is Pamela Gabriel from Bank of America. Pamela Gabriel is the Senior Vice President, San Diego Market Manager for Bank of America. In her role, she delivers the bank's environmental, social, and governance commitments for the San Diego market by identifying, building, and growing community partnerships. She creates and manages the local strategy for Bank of America, which includes foundation support for nonprofits addressing economic mobility issues in communities of need in San Diego. Thanks again, Pamela, for joining us today. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and start our slideshow here. Screen share that for everybody because we've got some fantastic visuals here to share. All right. So today's topic, as I mentioned, is restoring centuries-old artworks of cultural significance. And of course, Curtis's Orotone images are right there at the top for us. Before we get into the talk today, though, I want to recognize MOPA's role and also its location with respect to today's topic. For that, we have this statement that we've prepared, which really acknowledges MOPA's physical location on the Kumeyaay land. So the Museum of Photographic Arts recognizes that we sit on the ancestral homeland of the Kumeyaay Nation, past and present. The museum extends its respect and gratitude to the Kumeyaay peoples who call this land home. So here, I just wanted to bring up this first slide to really kick us off because this is one of Curtis's Oratones from MOPA's collection. And you'll notice it's not the image itself. It's also in a frame, and that was intentional. And we'll get into a little bit more about why that's important in just a moment here in the talk. To kick us off, Deborah, first question for you. So MOPA's collection contains a number of images by Edward Curtis, both Oratones as well as others works on paper. Can you talk a little bit about the holdings in the collection and how MOPA's come to acquire them over the years? MOPA's 37 years now.
So first of all, it's important for everyone to understand that our collection, our photographic collection, is about 9,000 images. We have a library with 22,000 volumes. I wish we had all of those pots behind Elysia, but we don't. But that's because we're a photographic museum. And the Curtis material, our collection spans the entire history of photography. It's not limited to California or regional, but it is actually the prehistory to contemporary photography. And the Curtis work came to us in over several different gifts over a period of time, and from about 4 different collectors. So we have about 175 Curtis photographs, and we have 13 of the Oratones. Just to give everyone a little bit of background, and probably your next slide has a picture of Curtis, but Edward Sheriff Curtis was known as the photographer of Native American nation and Native tribes in the United States. And he's best known for a project which we'll be talking about just a little bit, of the North American Indian, which was something that took about 30 years of his life to realize. And he was born in 1868 in Wisconsin. He really quit school in 6th grade and right after that, built his own camera, taught himself photography. And by age 17, he was actually apprenticing in a photographer's studio. His family moved around quite a bit. So by the time he was apprenticing, they were in Minnesota. And then after an incredibly bad winter, his father decided to move the family from Minnesota to Seattle. Having gone to school in Minnesota, I know exactly what that was all about. It's wind chill, minus 30, it can be pretty brutal. Curtis eventually sets up a studio, becomes a partner in a photo studio in Seattle, Washington, and begins photographing the well-known people, but also his first photograph of an individual of Native heritage was in that Seattle studio.
Great. Thank you for the context and for the background. And I think that's a critical part when we talk about both his work traveling to document Native American communities in at first the Pacific Northwest and later expanding into just the geographic west of the United States. And to get a little bit of that context of where he was located at that critical time, kind of moving westward, right? At a time when lots of other people were also moving westward, and then getting started there early in photography, of course, in the studio there in Seattle. So this question, I want to bounce over to Pamela Gabriel with Bank of America, because we're going to come up on, well, actually, before we get to that, the Oratones in particular, now that we kind of got a little bit of background about Curtis himself, they were identified for conservation in particular. All museums have collections which are in different states. And of course, conservation is an important part of fulfilling the mission of being a collecting institution. Deborah, can you tell us a little bit about why the Curtis Oratones were identified for conservation? What's unique about them that requires that kind of conservation?
Well, first of all, they're very special, and they are a positive image on glass that with the approach that Curtis took has a bronze powdered pigment that is mixed and applied to the back, which gives it this luminous quality. So it's a glass image, and the frame is very much a part of it. Well, being an image on glass with that kind of pigment and wood frame also means it's very delicate. And so these were not in the best shape. And so we were not really able to exhibit them, to share them, or even loan them to other exhibitions. So it became crucial to be able to conserve them, because they're a part of history that is very important. And to just have them and not be able to share them became an issue for us. And luckily, Bank of America had a program. We had been working on actually several projects with them over time. Bank of America, if I can digress just a little bit, has acquired over time a major photographic collection that was started in Chicago as the first photographic collection in the United States. A corporate photographic collection started in 1965. And as banks went out of business, were sold, were taken over, they eventually were acquired by Bank of America. We did a exhibition of that work and a book. It's traveling. And they, so we already had developed a fabulous relationship with a corporation, a bank that has a huge art collection. And as well, they offer grants for conservation.
Great, thank you for that. And thank you for that additional info about Bank of America and also MOPA's history there, the exhibition and also the first corporate collection, and learning a little bit more about that. And I think too, if we think about, why Oratones were produced by Curtis in particular, because he wasn't an artist dedicated solely to creating that kind of work. As you just said, Deborah, we have over 100 works in the collection that range in process, but Oratones are really unique for a few reasons. They were unique for the preservation and conservation project because they are delicate objects that require particular needs, but also I love this quote because it really is coming straight from Curtis's words, why he created Oratones, which of course he, in a very American way, branded them under his own name, the Kurt Tones, but they went by a few different names over the course of photographic history as people have experimented using gold toning to create a positive print, especially a positive print on glass. And I just love this quote, "The ordinary photographic print, however good, lacks depth and transparency, or more strictly speaking, translucency. But in the Kurt Tones, all the transparency is retained and they are as full of life and sparkle as an opal." So quite a beautiful way of putting it. And the works really do have that fantastic luminescence to them for two reasons, right? Because they were backed with, as you said in Curtis's process, that bronze pigment on the back of this positive print. And then because you're seeing them through glass and the emulsions on the backside, there's actually a depth to the glass where light refracts and reflects a little bit. So when when you look at them, they really do have this sense of depth that, as Curtis so beautifully puts it, your typical black and white photograph would not necessarily have that same kind of visual effect when you're looking at it. So here we have actually a video documenting part of the process that MOPA underwent in partnership with BACC as a result of the funding from Bank of America. And I'm gonna go ahead and roll this video. This video is actually showing the conservation of one of the frames. Because these are glass positives, encased in a frame, the frame actually becomes integral to the integrity of the image itself, because you know, we're all familiar flipping through albums of photographs. Imagine if the photographs were made of sheets of glass, right? You want to make sure that it has a nice case, and that's by no means a first in photographic history, right, Deborah? We have lots of examples where everywhere from daguerreotypes to ambrotypes, even tintypes would come in some little, you know, paper frame.
Paste image, yeah. I'm going
Absolutely.
to add 2 points. One is BPCC is Balboa Park Conservation Center, and they are located in Balboa Park. They're our neighbors in our building, and they are one of the few places in the West that does art conservation. And there was a second point, but I don't remember it, so it'll come to me.
Feel free to chime in at any point, Deborah. So for this, I'm going to go ahead and roll this video, which is showing the restoration of actually part of the frame that holds one of MOPA's 13 Oratones. And it'll give you a slight overview. It's going to be visual only because, Pamela, while this rolls, I'm going to go ahead and over to you and actually ask you a question about Bank of America's efforts in this area. Let me make sure I'm on mute there.
And it's only a minute.
It is, yep. Quick overview. So Pamela, this is a question for you. Bank of America provides important funding for institutions through its art conservation program to achieve their mission of preserving works in their care. Can you tell us more about the program itself overall as part of Bank of America and some of its goals?
Yes, absolutely. Well, first and foremost, thank you to you and Deborah for allowing us to be here and, of course, to be a part of this conservation. I personally have a passion for arts, and I was fascinated to learn about the Oratones conservation project, and so it's really exciting to be a part of this conversation, so thank you. Bank of America really has a huge arts and culture, a passion for preserving arts and culture and supporting the arts daily through our communities. As Deborah had mentioned, we had acquired many arts. And so in addition to the arts and conservation project, we also do arts in our communities, lending art to certain institutions throughout the country. But more specifically, to answer your question on the arts conservation project, the way that we do this is we do support multiple works across the country, actually in multiple countries throughout the year. So every year organizations go to apply and we review just to see how, you know, the works of art that we can really help to ensure and preserve the national treasures, especially when it's in danger of not being taken care of. And so for us, it really is a wonderful opportunity for us just to give back and ensure that these national treasures are taken care of.
Great, thank you for that. And I think, you know, it's again, really fascinating to think of the point that Deborah made, which is, you know, this is not only to ensure the funding to help conserve these images, isn't only to ensure that it will be safe within MOPA's own storage, but really if we think about not only ourselves as a collecting institution, but also a lending institution, you know, to be able to share these works with others, to be able to exhibit them in other places is a key component of making sure, or a key reason why we need to make sure that these are preserved and in the best shape possible, if you will.
So I just wanted to bring up something that was, first of all, want to thank Bank of America for providing this grant. And I believe that part of the process is staff gets to make comments about the applications that come in, or you have a special panel, internal panel. And one of the questions that we got there was some concern over the controversy around the Edward Curtis images. And the controversy being that over time that he was not, that these were not pure ethnographic images of Native individuals, that he was, taking clothing or objects from different nations or tribes and kind of mixing it. And so that a lot of that was something that was coming out in the 1970s when his work was being rediscovered. And there are 2 points that I think are really interesting, and I'll be very interested to hear Elysia's thought on this. But I tried to share that that again, these were not documents, that they were staged, but they were also extremely beautiful and well done and captured a time that was disappearing. And that even if there's something controversial, you don't hide work away. What you do is you share it and you talk and you have those multi-leveled conversations. And so there's definitely different ways of engaging with this work, because Curtis made, he spent, again, 24 years traveling around, photographing more than 100 Native nations and tribes, did hundreds of thousands of images, did cylinder audio recordings of songs, of ceremonies, on and on and on. But again, this idea now that we can look back at this work, it's got a history that is very multifaceted.
That's a fantastic point, and that segues perfectly into the next question for you, Elysia. Elysia Poon from the Indian Arts Research Center. So Curtis produced, as we were just saying, much of his work over 100 years ago, and certainly perspectives have changed as far as our understanding of photography and its role at the time. In Deborah, what you mentioned, what were considered ethnographic studies or documentary photography, it was certainly conducted in a very different way, to different standards than we would consider acceptable nowadays, for sure. So Elysia, for you, Curtis produced much of his work over 100 years ago. How is his work received within Native American communities in the United States today? Because, we've heard how cultural institutions are thinking about it, right? But the other part of the equation are those who are pictured and the ancestors of those who are pictured. Can you speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me here. As you can see the image there, it depicts some potters from Acoma Pueblo. I'm coming to you from Ogapoge Owenge, which is Tewa territory, or what is also known as Santa Fe, New Mexico. And Acoma Pueblo is just southwest of where we are. I think what's important to note, as Deborah has already mentioned, is that these photographs are not, in fact, pure documents. And in fact, it can be argued that there is always something additional, and there's a number of ways to look at any photograph that is taken. What is so interesting about these photographs is that while they were kind of marketed as a document in the North American Indian, it had an agenda behind it. If you look at the time frame, we were really focused at the time on this idea that Native American communities were eventually going to die out or assimilate into Native American cultures. We were neck deep in assimilation policies. Boarding schools are happening at this time. But at the same time, like everyone else, Native peoples were moving into the 20th century. And I think that's the critique that happens a lot, in that a lot of these images were edited in some way or staged in some way to take out evidence of the late 19th and early 20th century in the photographs. For example, if you look at another local pueblo, San Ildefonso Pueblo, one of the most famous potters to come from that area was Maria Martinez. And in fact, she showed at the Panama, California exposition in San Diego, which was held, of course, as you know, right in Balboa Park in 1915 and 1916. If you look at photographs that depicted Maria Martinez, you know, she's shown in this kind of old-timey way. There's no evidence of modernization in any of the photographs of Maria Martinez, as is in this photograph of the old well at Acoma. But if you actually look at what Maria Martinez was doing, you know, of course, the railroad was coming through at this time, and she was selling her pots to the public, as she was at the Panama, California exhibition. And she was saving up her money to buy things like stoves and sewing machines. And she was known as the first family to have a car. She had a Model T in the early 20s, the first car in San Ildefonso Pueblo, which was very early for really anyone to have their own private car, and spoke to her engagement with modern society on her own terms. And so I think that's one of the main critiques that happens within Edward Curtis's photographs. You know, not that he didn't have good intentions. He was concerned about the survival of Native peoples, and that was kind of the main thought for ethnographers, anthropologists, archaeologists at the time. We had something going on called salvage collecting, where a lot of museums, including museums in Southern California, New Mexico, were beginning to get started because people were concerned about the disappearance of Native peoples all throughout the country, and were collecting everything we could. That's how some of this collection behind me gets started. Not to say that this was the right way to go about things, right? But it was what they thought was the right thing at the time. And it's important now to look at these photographs within their context, but also examine from other perspective and look and provide opportunities for other stories to be told that are reflected in the photographs themselves or not reflected.
Thank you so much for that. And I think that brings to mind a very popular example, which we don't have in our slides today, of a Curtis image where it was famously an early use of, you know, photographic manipulation, we would essentially say, or photoshopping nowadays, where there was a modern alarm clock kind of seated between these two gentlemen that were in the photograph. And Curtis made sure to remove the clock, right? Because that was a very, you know, contemporary reference. And so by doing so, again, to kind of, as you mentioned, right, kind of to continue that narrative of this, you know, time before this vanishing culture, right? And to kind of push that narrative. So I think that's really fascinating. And I think, you know, we can look at, I'm going to come back to that slide in a second. We can look at some of these images really within that, this wider interest too in this romanticized pictorialist tradition, right? When I see a lot of Curtis's images, especially the ones that he chose to create the Oratones, because what we have to think about is, you know, Curtis created such a large body of work, and then he selected some of those to create these Oratones, right? So these aren't straight out of the camera positive images. These were ones that he was able to go through all of these thousands of images he created and select ones to reproduce as an Orotone. And the ones that he chose really have this cinematic quality to it. It reminds me of, you know, if Hollywood had existed in, you know, 1906, 1908, when he was creating these images, that's really what we're seeing here, right? We're not seeing necessarily something that would be to documentary standards today, which I think is really, really interesting. And I really think you can see that right throughout all of these works. So then I think, to kind of bounce back over to Pamela with Bank of America, can you share a little bit more about why these works in particular were selected by Bank of America, this project in particular?
Well, I have to be quite honest here, Kevin. with our arts conservation grants, Deborah had alluded to this earlier, it is actually a separate process than what we do here locally. So it is done with our national team, and they really take a look at a lot of different applications throughout the year and only provide grants to about 30 to 40 every year for the arts conservation specifically. And so in speaking with Rena, who is the head of our arts and culture in New York, and just knowing what their experience is, I mean, for me personally, I mean, it's definitely something that was very important to be selected out of hundreds of applications. And Deborah probably can even allude to this even more, as she was definitely part of the process during this time in 2018. But I mean, with knowing the way that they take a look at everything, it was a treasure that they really wanted to make sure to take care of and ensure that we had really kept that cultural heritage. But I will be honest, I do not sit on that particular committee, and we are not really privy to too much of how they make those decisions. But again, Deborah, if you have any comments from what you recall from back in 2018.
Well, I don't remember. Well, first of all, I don't remember. Well, I wasn't privy to how they make their decisions, but I do want to say that I really applaud them for not getting too wrapped up in controversy about it. And I did get to go to the reception in New York where they announced the winners. And it definitely is international. I mean, there's MOPA with the Metropolitan, and I think somebody from the Vatican, and the Dublin Museum of Art, and MOPA. So it really was, it was extraordinary, the reach of support for these kinds of projects.
Yes, so I think to date, oh no, of course. And that's why for me, when I had come to San Diego and learned about it, I am always fascinated with Bank of America's involvement in the arts, because a lot of people don't do that, nor do financial institutions. And for the arts conservation, we literally have done 170 projects in 33 countries. And so if you think about that, 170 over the years that we've been doing this in arts, and MOPA is one of them. And so out of 33 countries, it's pretty fascinating and amazing. And so it is quite an accomplishment.
That's fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. So I think when we look at these images again, and then think about it again, sort of, Elysia, in what you were mentioning, within the context of the 21st century, how are there any ways that you see the contemporary artists are responding to this work? Because I think that's the beauty of the arts, but also of photography in particular, is that we can reach this point where artists can do what I like to call this call and response, right? So they can revisit these older works with a new context and then build upon it, comment on it, criticize it, all of those sort of really interesting approaches to looking at historical works in photography. What are some of the ways that Native American artists are responding to Curtis's work today?
Yeah, there's a number of artists, specifically photographers, that are responding in some in less direct ways, some in more very, very direct ways. For example, if we look at the work of Chemehuevi photographer Cara Romero, she is depicting her community as alive and vibrant and contemporary today. We just saw an image called The Vanishing Race, and that was really the primary way of thinking around what was going on with Native peoples at the time. What you have here is basically a depiction of the Navajo long walk to Bosque Redondo, probably, is what's happening. This dates a little bit later, but it does recall that expulsion of Navajo peoples to Bosque Redondo in let's say the 1860s. If you look at the work of Cara Romero, they are incredibly vibrant pieces depicting youth, running through the desert, wearing their traditional regalia, but also being very contemporary in front of, brick walls and things like that. You know, there's this natural meshing of cultural elements and contemporary life that is very much absent in Curtis's photographs. Looking at photography in another way, if you look at the portraiture work that Makita Wilbur does, she is currently working on a project called, I think it's called Project 562. Her goal is to document all 562 recognized tribes in the United States, which is far more, what am I trying to say?
Many more than what Curtis did.
Far many more.
Yeah.
There we go. I can't even talk anymore. This is why I have my coffee here. Far many more communities than was documented in the North American Indians. And so this is about giving voice back to the communities, having a Native person on the other side of the camera, gaining permission and having full knowledge of the purpose of the project for the communities that she is photographing is really important.
Mhm.
Now, if we look at the work of Navajo photographer Will Wilson, he directly addresses the work of Curtis. In fact, he uses 19th century photographic processes like tintypes to document contemporary Native people. He photographs people. He also works with them to determine how they want to be depicted. And that's a really important element. We've already talked about how Curtis would remove items like the clock from the Blackfeet gentleman that was depicted in one of Curtis's photographs, and how he would sometimes mix and match tribal clothing to depict a particular way that he wanted viewers to see the photographs and understand, quote unquote, Native America, giving sitters the ability to control what is being depicted and what's behind the camera really challenges, you know, what Curtis was doing. In fact, I'll read you a quote by Will Wilson. He says, "I intend to challenge the documentary mission of Curtis from the standpoint of a 21st century indigenous trans-customary cultural practitioner. I want to supplant Curtis's settler gaze and the remarkable body of ethnographic material he compiled with a contemporary vision of Native North America." So if you look at his work, it's really not just about one person's idea, but a dialogue of between photographer and sitter that combines through his photographic work to determine what Native America is at this point, or in the moment that Will Wilson is photographing them. So those are just some examples of contemporary photographers that are kind of, I guess, bucking these ideas of what, you know, historically Native peoples have been viewed as particularly in the 19th century on forward.
Well, if we go back to the photographs, there's a whole conversation just about photographic style. I mean, Kevin mentioned pictorialism, and right there, that kind of soft approach, soft looking image, romanticized, again, is taking us away from that documentary to a former way of life that, as you were saying, you know, around the, if we look at the outside of this picture, it's the railroad is coming in. So many of the children have been taken to boarding schools and removed from their native environments and forbidden to speak their languages. That whole transition from the past to the present at that time, and now here we are 100 and some years later, 120 years later, 100 to 120 years later, revisiting and also using this as a way of getting artists, contemporary artists, to respond. So again, that points out why it was so important to conserve these works so that we can look at them and we can think about them. And I suspect as well that the Oratones themselves, with a frame, were meant to be displayed, purchased and displayed. The overall 20 volumes of the North American Indian was always envisioned to go to museums and libraries and some collectors. The support that he got from J.P. Morgan, who invested in it, he got $75,000 over 5 years in 1906. And that's equivalent to like $1.5 million today. But there were he had specific requirements, Morgan, when Curtis did this, that he couldn't earn a salary from it. It could only cover the cost of making the images and shooting them, and that they had to be reproduced in the highest quality. And there ended up being during Curtis's lifetime only 300 sets of these images that existed and tell this kind of story. And story, I think, is the right word. And the other thing to remember is photography is not real. No matter how much we think it is representational, it's always the point of view of the photographer, the way that, the processes that they're using, the titles, even. If you look at the captions, they add something to this that is more towards that romanticized view, which in reality was never that. I mean, I'm sure it was an incredibly proud but difficult existence,
Well, and thank you for mentioning that part in particular, Deborah, about photography itself and how there is, we like to think again of documentary photography as this noble cause of a photographer going to a particular location to photograph, but we always have to realize that that's still from one person's perspective, right? They may be guided by particular ethics and standards, but at the same time, at the end of the day, I always like to say, if you give 2 different people the assignment of going to photograph a tree and bring it back, they will approach it differently, right? It's the same tree, but each one will have a slightly different way of doing it. And so in that sense, again, to really remember that Curtis's work in that vein, right? It was in spirit ethnographic and documentary, but at the same time, he had a lot of leeway, if you will. And in particular, the Oratones, right? Because they were sort of this commercial aspect of printing these with this lustrous gold in order to sell for display, and even branding it with his own name and having them produced then in Southern California and LA for sale. Just kind of a really interesting way of sort of seeing this wider project in a slightly different context. I want to make sure we go ahead and get the chance to answer any questions from any of our attendees. Your questions can be for any of our panelists, all of them. And so let's just go ahead and see if anybody has any questions. Feel free to unmute and weigh in.
Or if our panelists have anything additional that they want to add. I mean, there's so much to really talk about with the work, and it's a number of museums have done exhibitions with Curtis work and contemporary Indigenous people's work. They have not just photography, but painting as well as photography. So again, that conversation is going on, which I think is really quite valuable at this time. So Kevin, do you have more? I know you've worked quite a bit with this material.
I think we did have somebody.
Patricia just saying goodbye.
Oh, gotcha.
Is my...
Yes, we can hear you.
Sound okay. I was wondering, technically the image is contact printed on the back of the glass as far as you're viewing the image and then the bronzing material is put on top of the actual silver.
That's
You know,
correct.
Go ahead, Kevin.
Deborah, did you want to take that one? I also have a great
So
cross-section
it's a positive, yeah, though this is a negative that you're seeing here, but a positive would have been made on glass. And then there seem to be a couple of different approaches. You can see that there is a diagram on the screen where the pigment is being applied to a backing piece, which is then sandwiched with the glass positive. And that is one way of doing it, though I think some of ours had it painted directly on the positive. So.
That's correct. Yeah. So in particular, Curtis's, when he created the Curtone process, because again, Orotone, he didn't start the Orotone process. It had a longer tradition already in photography and also in other arts as well. But Curtis's work in particular actually applied that gold pigment to the back of the glass, which also then had the positive image printed on it. So you can think you have a piece of glass, you print a contact print a positive image onto the back of it, and then mixing bronze powder with banana oil, of all things. There's actually some interesting stories about just how much the studio, just the whole place smelled like banana oil, which has this very astringent, very powerful smell. But it was used so that essentially when you're tilting that plate, like a lot of photographers do who work with glass plate processes, the gold pigment is then spreading evenly all the way to the edge of the image. And then it's finally encased in the frame itself to protect it and for display.
One of the questions was, where are the negatives? The negatives are in multiple locations, the ones that still exist. When Curtis died, he never made money on this whole project, and because he estimated that he needed to sell 500 subscriptions, and they were costing about $70,000 in today's dollars, and not many people had that. You had an economic downturn, you had a world war, and so interest changed. But when the Morgan, JP Morgan family had quite a bit of the material, and they sold it very cheaply to an antiquarian who then distributed it. But there is on the Curtis website links to various collections and who has negatives and who doesn't, who has papers and letters. And so we don't. So, but in general, I think there's a place in Indiana that has some negatives. If you email us, I can send you a link to the place where it lists where everything is located.
Great. Do we have any other questions from our audience members today? Feel free to unmute your microphone. And
this is Dave Checkley. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
We can. Yep.
I appreciated this very much. It's wonderful. The question I have is whether the descendants of any of the people that are imaged in these photographs are known. Thank you.
Yes, they are. And the Curtis website has also done interviews, not just with descendants of people in the pictures, but indigenous artists, other scholars who have responded to this work. So not everybody's identified, but some people have been identified. And they're very excited to actually see this work.
Great question.
So what makes this process particularly delicate? Well, glass. If you've ever moved from one place to another, your glass breaks easy. But also, depending on how well the emulsion was applied to the glass, that's one issue. How it's stored, moisture can affect things a little bit. The banana oil was used because it was not soluble in water, but and then the wood frame. In the video, you actually saw her repairing the frame. So in some cases, the frame was in worse shape. In other cases, it was both the glass image and the frame. And in others, it was just the image itself. But it's definitely when you have glass that can be problematic, how it's been stored.
Mm. And I've also heard that that's actually the way that Curtis went about the process with the Orotone, by using the banana oil and the bronze powder to coat all the way to the edge, helped to actually make it give it a little bit more longevity, because it had less tendency to separate, which is what you were just talking about, Deborah. A lot of images, whether they're positives or negatives, on glass, a lot of times that emulsion back, right, can start to separate or flake off because of certain environmental factors. And you have to also think, these in a frame made of wood wants to expand and contract, and glass can break. So kind of all adds to just how fragile these images actually are.
I have one more question, if I could, Dave Checkley here.
Yeah.
And that is whether or not the subjects of the photographs ever saw the photographs.
Great question. Great question. Deborah, do you want to speak to that? Or
I
Elysia, do you have any?
I don't know for a fact, but he did go back and do some films. And I know, so he would meet with some of the same people again. I suspect that he did, that these people did get to see some of the images. Without doing some in-depth research, I don't know for a fact.
I wonder if Elysia could comment regarding contemporary photographers of Native Americans, and whether they intentionally give back what they take, if you will. Thank you.
Are you talking about like non-native photographers photographing native subjects? Is that the question?
It could even be a native photographer photoing a native subject. I'm just curious what reciprocity might exist.
Yeah. So for example, with Will Wilson, it was very much a reciprocal relationship. So it's a tintype process that Will works with. And so the original tintype actually goes to the sitter. He does not keep them. And he just requests that he be able to scan a high resolution image of the tintype, and that is what he uses for his works. And then the original sitter keeps the tintype itself. I sat for him, my husband sat for him, and so we have, 2 tintypes in our homes, which are really wonderful. And it's amazing to have possession of. It's something that's so incredible. I think particularly about 19th century photography is things that are printed on tin or glass. They have this remarkable depth to them, and do have the ability, as I suspect with the Oratones, to kind of bring these figures to life. And it's amazing to hold the materiality of these photographs in your hands, and to not just see it as a digital print or see it go on and have their lives elsewhere, but to have the originals, and that belongs to you, and your image belongs to yourself. There's a question about what size tintypes does Will Wilson do? I would say they're about 8 by 10. Yeah.
Well, and also to build on that a little bit too, Elysia, you had mentioned Matika Wilbur's work, and also pointed to participatory photography. So in response to sort of that reciprocity, there are photographers who consider their approach to be more participatory, in that really working with the subject to see how they wish to be portrayed. So, and that in itself, approaching subject matter like that, there's a give and take, right? Between the sitter, the subject, and the photographer. There's a conversation that's happening, and all of that goes into the final work, rather than it feeling like somebody just literally taking a photograph and taking that away from the subject. So I think that's also another way, right? Either physically
Yeah,
giving prints,
absolutely. And
but
it really changes what the photograph looks like. I think a really great contemporary example, taking it out of the Indigenous discussion right now, is looking at Beyonce's cover of Vogue, right? Where she had a lot of creative control over who was her photographer and how she was being photographed, which if you look at other covers, really, really is dramatically different. And so what gets portrayed in a photograph dramatically shifts when you give the sitter control over how you are being represented.
And that approach and that consciousness about being more participatory is really a direct result from a greater awareness of photography's earlier role in being able to sort of, go into these places, take photographs, take them out of their context, out of those locations, and display them for other people who might not know the entire story, right? And also then, of course, not compensating those individuals or recognizing them in the way they should be. So it's really interesting to kind of see how contemporary artists are doing that. We have Natalie, who's raised her hand with a question. Natalie, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
But it's not quite a question. I work at the San Diego History Center, and we have a collection of Kumai photographs taken by Davis from 1900 to 1949. And so we have, the family gave us the negative and the prints of his work. And he photographed all the tribes from all over San Diego County and Mexico, and all the way to, when we were archiving the collection, we had a meeting with the different tribes, and the people who were in the photographs, they had a family member. We talked to the family members and stuff like that, and try to preserve the history of the Kumai here. And the family gave it to us because it would have been, if we give it back to the tribes, the collection would have been very kind of separated, and would have created some very difficult political difficulty to, so the thing could be preserved. But we worked with local tribe, and it's very interesting. And now they are very much developing their own museum, and preserving their culture, with the language and stuff like that. So we can collaborate with them about, and because we have the images that can help them, preserve their culture. And so that was very interesting. And it's we are part of a, everywhere. It's difficult. It's always a difficult approach, but the important is that it's not them and us. It's we are all on the same territory, and try to collaborate the best we can to preserve the history and keep it going. So.
Well, I think that collaborative approach, it speaks really well to Elysia, your work with the Indian Arts Research Center, and again, really the mission of it is to look at how collecting institutions like MOPA and Natalie, like the San Diego History Center, and Native American communities can work together to foster and to promote that cultural heritage, rather than the cultural institutions just going it alone kind of thing. Do you want to add on to that?
Yes, sure. So as the Indian Arts Research Center, we're actually a non-exhibiting institution. We largely function as a research center. You can think of it as kind of a think tank for museology, as we try to find better ways to work with the communities that are represented within our collection, which in our case is about 12,000 items of Native Southwest art and history. We have various different types of programs, largely from the bottom up. So we work with different communities to determine what are the most kind of pressing needs or important programs that for the communities. We work with them to each different community to determine what's appropriate to be displayed, different levels of access for items within our collection, items that are determined sensitive or inappropriate to display are removed immediately and not given access to the general public. So we always try to acknowledge, or always do acknowledge, that the primary knowledge lies within the community itself and go from there. And so we have a number of initiatives that are both at the community level as well as a policy level to kind of reinforce the importance of equitable relationships between the objects within museum collection and the communities and the very, very real people that exist behind them. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's basically what we do.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. So does anyone else have any questions who are in attendance? Feel free to go ahead and weigh in. I want to make sure we get to everyone's questions.
I think we're good.
Yeah. Okay, great. So just to kind of wrap up here, I want to kick this question back over to Pamela. Pamela, I think we've really touched on the importance that Bank of America finds in providing this kind of funding for cultural projects and works of cultural significance. How can others learn more about Bank of America's efforts in this area?
Absolutely. You can definitely visit bankofamerica.com/foundation or reach out to me. The Arts and Culture Foundation is part of a larger structure where Bank of America's foundation is really focused on helping to create economic mobility within our communities. And most recently, we definitely also made a $1 billion commitment to ensure that we're advancing racial equality in everything that we're doing within our foundation. And so while the arts has its own foundation and its own support, and we truly believe in the power of the arts and how it really enriches our communities, and the support of our nonprofits and arts and cultures right now is so significant to help our communities thrive. And so I would say to learn more about it, you can definitely go there, or I'm always happy to answer any questions you may have, as we and I am really just quite passionate about what we do in supporting the community.
Thank you so much. Thank you again. And then Elysia, to wrap up, where can everyone go to find out more information about both the Indian Arts Research Center as well as the wider School for Advanced Research?
So you can find us at sarweb.org, and you can just navigate to the Indian Arts Research Center to learn about more of what we do. If you're looking for some guidance on kind of creating some equitable relationships between collections and communities, we have a document called the Guidelines for Collaboration that helps with that process on both the community level as well as the museum level. And that can be found at guidelinesforcollaboration.info.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Deborah, any closing words for us today?
No, just thank you to our guests today, all of them, including our panelists. I always love it when I learn something new, and we are eager to show the Oratones. Because of the current situation, we haven't been able to, so this is our virtual way of being able to do that. And Elysia, we should find out some ways of working across our institutions.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
I think that would be great to have you and your organization institution involved. So thank you. And Kevin, thank you. You did a great job.
Well, thank you very much. It was an absolute pleasure. I had the fun part about learning more and hearing everyone's response. responses. And I think it was just such a great opportunity to get these different perspectives. And, you know, I think with any conversation like this, but especially ones that touch on some of the topics that we addressed today, is that rather than this being sort of the capstone to, or the end to this project, really that it can be the start of this, again, an ongoing conversation. And like you said, Deborah, you know, maybe future opportunities to exhibit it. Elysia, maybe future opportunities to collaborate as well with SAR and the Indian Arts Research Center. So I think that's a really exciting thing to look to the future.
And this is only the beginning. So thank you all.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. And thank you again to our panelists. And we look forward to seeing you at the next Winescapes.
We'll see you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.